You've probably already seen the title of my thesis when you walked into this room, but I wanted to show it to you again with a picture that a little bit more shows what I'm going to be talking about. So let's brace yourself for a short introduction about my thesis and what actually holds paper fibers together and the magic of fiber joints. So first of all, I want to talk about the motivation behind why we even investigate this. So paper materials are what we like to call semi-structural materials. So they need to sustain some load, but they have pretty different applications. So in order to be able to design the properties for the specific application, because we might want to either not break them or we actually might want to break them, then we need to understand how and why the properties behave the way they do so that we can actually design a proper material. And in order to do that, we need to look a little bit deeper into what kind of material paper actually is. I believe all of you in here have held a piece of paper in your hands, and some of you probably already know that it consists out of networks of cellulose fibers or paper fibers. Those fibers are held together by what we call fiber joints, and it means that those are the things that transfer the load in the network. So without any joints, we wouldn't have paper materials that could transfer loads. And in order to change the properties of a paper product, you can either change the properties of the fiber itself or of the interactions or the fiber joints. And that has been the topic of my research. So the research question is, how do the fiber joint properties impact the network performance? And I've studied this topic in two ways. So one of it is a joint formation and drying, so basically what happens before we utilize and use the product. And the second part has been focusing on the properties of the joint and the networks evaluated after the formation, so in the using state. And so the first part has been included in paper 1, where we simulated a model joint of a paper fiber, and in paper 2, where we also looked at residual strengths imposed during drying. The second part has been mostly evaluated by surface-modified fibers combined with various density levels. And this has been investigated in two parts. So in paper 2, we have done mechanical, so experimental characterization of these materials. And in paper 3, we have also modeled these using network modeling framework. And then we've also looked at a different type of material, which is a dry-formed material, that we have tested in different loading modes. And this is special because it has very different joint properties than the properties in the wet-formed materials. So I want to start about the joint formation and drying and give you an extremely quick overview about how you make paper. So in essence, in the conventional way of making paper, we use a lot of water. And into this water, we put a little bit of fibers. So we get this wet fiber water slurry that we then machine and process to get the paper product that we want. But we should remember that this slurry is very wet, as I said, and in order to make a paper product, we need to dry it. So we apply some sort of heat, and when we do that, the network will want to shrink because the fibers are hygroscopic, so the swelling is reversible. However, when we do this, we often apply some sort of restrictions on the network. So for example, in a paper machine, you pull on the sheet in one direction, or if you do a sort of molding procedure, then you also restrain it. And that means that the network will have imposed restrictions that will affect the geometry and the composition of the network, but also the properties of fibers and the properties of joints. So this is something we have looked at specifically for the joints in paper 1. So this is a cellulose model surface that has been extensively developed and characterized in the research group of my co-supervisor, Lars Wågberg. And so this is basically a very, very, very simplified version of a fiber. So it has a very well-defined geometry because it's perfectly spherical and it has a very smooth surface. But the important thing is that it's similar to a fiber in the sense that it has the same main constituent, which is the cellulose. So you can use it to sort of try different way of enhancing the adhesion and then isolate the adhesion property without including all of the complexities in a fiber. So the idea here was to look at this cellulose bead that they've previously tested, and what is specifically of interest for me is the contact zone, because that is where the adhesion happens. So what I did in paper 1 was developed an axisymmetric model of the bead, which was then solved in a finite element software. And of course, here we also have the contact region included. And in order to get reliable results and a good solution, we have a fine mesh discretization at this zone. And so a little bit of the specifics about the model. The modeling was done in 3 steps. So the first step is a compaction. So in order to get the bead into contact with the underlying surface, we compressed it. And then it was unloaded in the second step with the cohesive or the contact region activated so that it actually sticks to the surface. And then in the third part, moisture diffusion field was applied to allow the bead to shrink. And this is the most important step because this is what we actually compared to the experiments. The material models there were 2 material models. So one in the bulk of the bead. It was an hyperelastic model based on measurements of E modulus for the bead that was done in experimentally in the previous paper. And then we also had a cohesive interaction in the contact zone. And both of these material laws are moisture dependent because the bead changes its characteristics quite a lot as it dries. And the idea here was to tailor mostly the cohesive and moisture parameters to make sure that we get a good agreement between experiment and the numerical simulation. And that agreement was quantified or evaluated by comparing the radius of the bead and the radius of the contact zone. And these are the experimental results from the experimental study. And as you can see, our simulations agree really well. But this in itself is not an interesting result because this is something we already knew. But what can we then use this model for to actually get something that we didn't already know? One of those things is we can evaluate the damage at the contact zone. So what you see in this plot, this red line represents the damage. And so the damage is a measure of how much the contact has degraded. So when it reaches 1, you have a separation between the surfaces. And in this case, we could see that after completed drying, as is shown in this plot here, we have quite a large zone where there is no damage. But close to the edge of the contact, we have almost full damage. And this shows that this is the starting state for the joint after we've completed the drying process. And this is something that is not often considered when modeling network materials or joints. So this model gives us the possibility to study the initial state in the model joints, or so to say, the post-drying state, including the drying restrictions in post. So the next part in my thesis is about the joint properties and network density. So what you see here is an illustration of a cross-section of a fiber network material. And when we press it to a certain density, we will have a certain number of joints that hold the forces, the load together. So you can imagine it's like several people holding something together. And when we increase the density by pressing it, we will increase the number of joints and you will have a stronger network because there are more joints sharing the load. Another way of enhancing the properties of networks is by doing a sort of joint enhancement. So you change the chemistry in the joint in different ways. And that essentially increases the load-bearing capacity because the individual joints become stronger. And this is something I have investigated in my work. And I will show you a few examples from paper 2. So what we did here is we hot-pressed sheets to different hot-pressed sheets from which we then cut tensile specimens. And we had 2 different types of pulp. And we pressed them to 3 distinct density levels to be able to compare the densities between each other. And then we also included surface modifications, which is a form of joint enhancement, to actually see how that affects the properties of the networks. And I will give you a super, super quick crash course on the layer-by-layer method. It's basically a way of putting polymer on the surface of the fiber. So in this case, it's 2 polyelectrolyte layers that together create a very good adhesion of the surface. And I will be talking a little bit about bilayers, and 1 bilayer is then 2 layers of polyelectrolyte. So the results in this study, I only have a few minutes here to show you some selections. But first of all, I want to show you the specific strength for the unmodified fiber. So this is only for the density effect. And as you can see, we have a clear increasing trend. When we increase the density, we get a higher specific strength. And this is not surprising. This is something we already knew because, as I said, we increase the number of joints, we have better load-bearing capacity. However, what actually happens in the material? So as you can see here, to the right, we have a SEM image of the failure surface. And as you can see, you have long fiber segments sticking out in the low density case. When we increase this density, you can see that the fiber segments sticking out are much shorter. And this is because when you have joints breaking, the fibers pull apart from each other. While when you increase the density, you have more joints, then more load is put on the individual fibers, and more fibers actually break because of this. So what is then the effect of adding in the surface modifications here? As you can see, we still sustain this increasing trend. And what was most surprising here was that we were able to get better specific strength for the high density networks with added modifications, because it has been believed that at high density you have a domination of fiber failure, but we could actually show that we can enhance it even further by making the joints stronger. And if we have a look the same way as we did before, you can see at the low density with the surface, the highest level of modification, we have shortened these fiber segments sticking out quite a little bit. But if we go to the highest density with the surface modification, we have a quite dramatic effect on the fiber segments sticking out. So here we have a very optimized network that is really, the joints are not bearing any load compared to the fibers, basically. And so this investigation showed us that we can improve network performance by the layer-by-layer treatment, even for high-density networks. We wanted to further evaluate this because we also saw a similar effect on the stiffness, which is not really related to the strength of the joints, but rather something else. And we wanted to evaluate this by looking at the restrictions imposed in the networks during drying. And therefore, we did some hygroexpansion measurements, and we did them on the materials with and without modifications. We didn't distinguish between levels of modification, and we also looked at only the lowest and the highest density. And this hygroexpansion measurement is a way of basically changing the relative humidity around the networks and then measuring how much they have expanded. And when we, as I showed you in the beginning, when we dry a network under restriction, we will impose restrictions in the network and it will be strained. And that means that it will affect the possibility for the network to expand further when you increase the moisture. So the more the network is restricted, the less it will want to expand when we increase the moisture. So first of all, this is a strain moisture content plot. And as you can see, we have 4 different levels of relative humidity starting from 20%. And this is the base case, so the low density without any surface modifications. And there are 2 interesting things to look at in this curve. So first of all, it's the expansion at increasing moisture. So when we go from 50% relative humidity up to 87. So as you can see, this slope is quite different from the other slopes in the picture, which is because of the restrictions in the network is not allowed to expand as much. And the other part is the residual negative strain that we're left with. So it basically means that after the completed moisture cycle, we have a permanent negative deformation of the networks. And if we then include the effect of the surface modification, we see that for the low density, it only changes the final residual strain. If we look at the effect of increasing the density without surface modification, we can see that we affect both of these. But if we combine them, we see a dramatic effect on both of these things. And it really shows that we have changed something in the network structure. So we reduce the slope by having the high density, and the effect is even combined when we amplified when we combine it with surface modification. And what we have shown is that by including the surface modifications, we actually change the residual state post-drying of the networks. And of course, there were a lot of interesting things to look into here, which is why we went into network modeling of these materials. So a network model is a way of replicating the material specifically. So we do imaging of fibers to get their geometries and their characteristics, and then we replicate them numerically with a model that models each fiber as a beam element. And in our model, we used a bilinear elastic plastic model for the fibers and a cohesive traction separation law for the joints. So in total, we have 5 material parameters here that are the ones that we use to tailor the behavior. And the idea here is that we want to replicate the tensile tests that we've done in the experiments by numerically doing the same thing. and then we tailor these parameters to match the stress-strain behavior. So we did this only for the low-density materials, but for all 4 levels of modification. And as you can see, the results agree quite well. So the dashed lines are the simulations. So especially in the beginning of the curve, where we have the initial linear region, it's a very good agreement, and this maximum stress, the strength, also agrees quite well. We do not fully capture the strain at failure, which is due to a difference in the network size between the experiments and the numerical solutions. But what is interesting, that what we could look at, is how these parameters that we tailored developed with the added bilayers. So what we could see was that the fiber properties more or less developed continuously, whereas the joint strength reached saturation at some point. And then the question arises, do we change the properties of the fibers by adding this layer by layer treatment? The idea was to only affect the properties of the joints. So we looked into this further by evaluating if the layer by layer treatment actually influenced something else, like the number of joints formed in the network or the joint stiffness. And what we could say was that the surface modification doesn't only affect the properties of the joints, but also the whole composition of the network. And this is why we see this effect also on the fiber properties, because it's a secondary effect of the network geometry. The final part of my work has been about dry form materials. I told you in the beginning that we need a lot of water to create paper conventionally, but water is expensive, it's not good for environmental reasons, and it also takes quite a lot of time to dry a network, which is why there has been a lot of development of dry forming in the industry lately. So there has been dry forming techniques used previously, but what is new about this in the recent years, it's actually used for the semi-structural applications such as packaging and so on. So this is an example from Yangi that I've worked with and characterized their materials. So what we were interested in this work is to follow the development of the properties during the forming process. And so when we form a material from previous studies, we know that it's subjected to a multi-axial load state, so in-plane tension, out-of-plane shear, and out-of-plane compression. And so we wanted our testing to reflect these modes. So we did tension testing, and we did also an out-of-plane shear test that you can see here, that is called the rigid block shear method. And then finally, we also tested the materials in transversal compression. And then the idea for all of these tests was to be able to follow how these properties develop with the densification. So the materials that we tested were in a broad range of densities, from very, very sparse, fluffy pads up to highly consolidated networks. And I will show you a selection of the results. So this is the specific modulus for both shear and tension. And I want to show you 2 interesting things about these curves. And we're looking mostly at the trends. The numbers are not the most interesting part here. So first of all, how are these curves similar? Both of them show an increasing trend with density. And this is the specific modulus. And that means that we're not only increasing the stiffness when we increase the density, we're increasing it more than we increase the density. And that is interesting that we could see that, because in my opinion, that means that we're somehow changing the structure of the network, which means we form fiber joints, even though we don't have any water. And the second part is how these curves are different. So in the tensile test, we have a continuous increase of the specific modulus. However, in the shear test, we see that we have a threshold level before we start increasing this property. And we believe this is likely due to an activation of the network, that we need to have enough joints formed to actually get some sort of shear resistance in the network. And the trends are similar, for example, for the strength as well. So this is something we see, that we also increase the load-bearing capacity in the network. And then we can also have a quick look at the compression test. So this one was a little bit harder because we couldn't quantify the stiffness or the strength, for example. But these are curves shown for the 2 lowest densities and for the 2 highest densities. And the first thing that is interesting about these curves, again, how they are different. So we have a completely different behavior for the sparse fluff compared to the sheet that has been formed with both heat and pressure. The second part that is interesting is that they have a big difference in the final density. So we are able to compress the sparse fluff a lot more than we're able to compress the formed sheets. And I believe this is due to the fact that in the forming process, with the added heat and pressure, we have formed joints that actually restrict the network from deforming in plane when we press it in the out of plane direction. And so what we could conclude here was that we do create joints in the dry formed forming process, despite the fact that we don't have any water. So to summarize my research here, we have brought the possibility to study the initial post-drying state in model joints, and this model can be further extended to even further understand the mechanisms that are at play in the formation of joints and the adhesion mechanisms. I've also studied the surface modification, in this case the layer-by-layer treatment, and what we've shown is that it improves network properties even at high densities, and through higher expansion measurements we were able to show that it affects the residual state post-drying in the network, which we further evaluated with network modeling, and we could show that it has to affect the network composition, not only the joint properties. And finally, through the dry forming process, we can create joints despite the absence of water. So, I would like to thank you all for being here today. I would also like to thank the funders of my research projects, so the Knut and Alice Wallenberg Foundation and the Strategic Research Fund Bioinnovation as well. A big thank you goes out to my supervisors who have been with me and guided me along the way. Thank you to my colleagues, friends, family for being with me during this time. And thank you all for your attention today.